The Green family's house stood in the quiet suburbs of Michigan, nestled among rows of perfectly manicured lawns and picket fences. On the surface, it was a picture-perfect home. 2 parents, 4 children, and a life that looked straight out of a magazine. Gregory Green, a man in his 40s, had spent years cultivating this image. His wife, Faith, was his world. Together, they raised their 2 children, while also nurturing Faith's 2 from a previous marriage. They were a family in the truest sense, at least outwardly. But underneath this well-kept facade, something was wrong. It wasn't apparent at first. Gregory didn't know exactly what it was, but the cracks began to appear as Faith started spending more time away from home. Work commitments, she said. And yet Gregory couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was changing. He watched as Faith grew more distant, retreating into herself while he was left to fend off the nagging feeling of abandonment. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Gregory's suspicions first began to spiral. He walked past the kitchen where Faith was chatting on the phone with someone. She sounded jovial, almost too jovial, her laughter a sharp contrast to the stillness of their home. Gregory paused. "She's really been good to you, hasn't she?" a male voice said. Gregory's heart stopped. The voice was unfamiliar, too casual, too intimate. Faith's laughter followed. Gregory shook his head, forcing the thoughts away. He had no right to eavesdrop. But something in that exchange lingered, like the echo of a memory he didn't quite want to acknowledge. The day wore on, but that conversation gnawed at him, clinging to the edges of his mind. He didn't ask Faith about it. No, it wasn't that simple. He couldn't. And yet, every time she glanced at him with that soft, distracted smile, he felt like she was miles away. As evening came, Gregory sat in his study, scrolling through emails. His thoughts were far from work. They lingered on the call, the unsettling familiarity of it, how close it sounded, and how effortlessly Faith responded. What was going on? He couldn't stop thinking about it. The walls of his home, once so comforting, felt like they were closing in. His finger hovered over his phone. For a moment, he thought about calling Faith, but he stopped. She was right there in the next room. It didn't make sense, did it? So instead, he searched her name on the family computer, his mind spinning. He found it, a conversation from months ago. Faith had been talking to the same man, an old friend as she called him. But what really struck him was the name that appeared on her contact list. Ethan. That name. It was too familiar, and not in the way he had hoped. Gregory's breath caught in his throat. Ethan. The man Faith had been seeing before they were married. The man she had promised never to contact again. Gregory's fingers trembled as he clicked on the chat history. The messages were innocent enough at first, just casual check-ins. But as the conversation progressed, something in the tone shifted. Too friendly, too close. His mind raced, his pulse quickened. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a warning. Something was changing, and Gregory had been too blind to see it. Faith's phone rang from the kitchen, a familiar tune. She picked it up, and he could hear her soft voice as she greeted Ethan. It was all too much. The realization hit him like a freight train. His world, everything he thought he knew, was collapsing. He wanted to confront her, ask her everything. But how could he? How could he confront her with something so raw, so damning, when he wasn't even sure of the truth? The anger inside him began to boil. But more than anger, there was something deeper, something darker. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the feeling of being betrayed by the very thing he had built his life around. He closed the computer and stood up, his hands shaking. The house felt foreign now, the once cozy corners now suffocating. Faith entered the room, her eyes meeting his. The familiar smile she gave him didn't feel genuine anymore. It was a mask. Gregory could see through it. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The truth hung between them, an invisible weight. Neither of them acknowledged it, but both knew it was there. Faith reached out, her hand resting on his arm. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Gregory didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say, but the silence that followed was enough. And for the first time in years, Gregory felt completely alone. The next few days passed in a fog for Gregory. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and anger, but the truth about Faith's betrayal gnawed at him with a relentless persistence. He couldn't stop thinking about it, about Ethan. The name clung to him, echoing in every corner of his thoughts. Each time he saw Faith, he felt a sickening disconnection between them. It was like looking at a stranger wearing her face, The warmth they once shared was gone, replaced by a coldness that seeped into their conversations. Their interactions became brief, distant, and Gregory noticed, more than ever, how she avoided eye contact, how she spent more time on her phone. One evening, as Faith got up to answer a call, Gregory decided he couldn't take it anymore. He had to know. He couldn't live with this weight hanging over him. Without a word, he followed her into the other room, standing just out of sight. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw her laugh softly, a sound he once found comforting, but now it sent a shiver down his spine. The moment she hung up, Gregory stepped into the room. She looked at him, startled, but her expression quickly masked itself behind a smile. "Who was that?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "A colleague," Faith replied, her eyes darting away from him. Gregory could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. He stared at her, his mind racing. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch out between them, thick and suffocating. "I heard you laughing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't laughing," Faith countered quickly, though the way her fingers fidgeted with the phone betrayed her anxiety. The tightness in Gregory's chest grew, constricting his breath. The disbelief that had been simmering within him for days now bubbled over. Was it just a colleague, or was it something else, something more intimate? He didn't ask. He didn't need to. The answer was already clear. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the darkness feeling suffocating. The small voice in the back of his mind told him he was overreacting, but he couldn't shake it. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that something had changed between them. Something had been broken, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the cracks in their relationship were widening. The next day, as Faith was out running errands, Gregory went to the drawer where she kept her old notebooks. He'd never snooped before, but in that moment, it felt like the only way to understand what had been happening behind his back. He rifled through the papers, each page heavier than the last. And then he found it. A letter. A letter from Ethan. Gregory's hands trembled as he read the familiar handwriting, sentiments of affection, words that he had once reserved for Faith. His stomach churned as he pieced together the fragments of a past he hadn't known about. He hadn't been the only one who was blind in their marriage. Faith had kept her connection with Ethan alive, far longer than Gregory had realized. Every word in that letter sent shockwaves through his body. It was clear that their relationship, whatever it had been, had not ended as neatly as Faith had claimed. It wasn't just a casual affair. It was a deep, lingering connection that still held weight in her life. He had been a fool to think she had moved on. Gregory could feel his pulse racing as his mind spun out of control. He tried to calm himself, to make sense of what was happening. But the truth was simple. He had been living a lie. His whole life with Faith, the family, the stability, was all built on secrets and half-truths. The love he thought was mutual had been tainted from the beginning. With a sinking feeling, he realized he had to confront her. But how? What could he say to make sense of all the anger and betrayal he was feeling? The weight of it felt unbearable. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison. He couldn't breathe in it. Every corner, every room was suffused with the lies they had built together. But there was one thing he knew for sure now. This wasn't just about Ethan. It was about everything. The family he had tried to build. The trust that had been shattered. Gregory felt like he was standing on the edge, unable to look away from the abyss that yawned in front of him. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't pretend that everything was fine. He had to confront Faith, and he had to do it now. The day Gregory found the letter was the day everything changed. It wasn't just a letter from Ethan. It was a declaration of everything he had feared, everything that had been lurking in the corners of his mind. It was the proof that Faith had never really let go. The lies that had been so carefully woven between them, the trust that had been so deliberately built, now lay in tatters. He sat in the living room, the letter still clenched in his hand, as the weight of the truth pressed down on him. The silence in the house felt suffocating. Every moment he had spent with Faith, every meal, every laugh, every quiet conversation, suddenly felt tainted, like a bad memory he couldn't escape. Faith had never been the woman he thought she was. She had been hiding pieces of herself, pieces that Gregory couldn't even begin to comprehend. The realization sank deeper into his chest, making it harder to breathe. His love for her felt like a cruel joke now. He stood up abruptly, the sudden motion startling him. He didn't know what to do with himself. His legs carried him into the kitchen, where he stood at the counter, hands trembling as he ran them over the cold surface. Everything felt out of place. The house, once a symbol of comfort, now felt like a foreign land. There was no escape from the storm swirling inside him. Faith wasn't home yet. She'd gone out to run errands, something she did more and more often these days. He knew she'd be back soon, and when she did, he would confront her. He could no longer pretend. The calm, the cool facade he had been holding on to was gone. The door opened with a soft creak, and Faith stepped inside. She smiled, but when she saw Gregory standing in the middle of the room, the smile faltered. "Gregory, what's wrong?" Her voice was tentative, like she already knew. His gaze flickered to the letter in his hand, still in his fist. It was a small piece of paper, but it had the power to ruin everything. Everything he thought was true, everything he had worked for. "I found it," he said, his voice strained but controlled. His hand shook slightly as he held up the letter. "I found your letter to Ethan." Faith froze, her face going pale. For a long moment she didn't speak, her eyes darting between Gregory and the letter. The silence between them stretched, thick with the unspoken truths. "I thought we were past this," Gregory continued, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. "You promised me you were done with him, but you never were you?" Faith opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her hands clenched at her sides as she slowly stepped forward, as if trying to close the gap between them. "Gregory, please." But Gregory shook his head, cutting her off. "No, don't. Just don't." His voice cracked, the weight of everything hitting him all at once. He had spent years trusting her, believing in their future, only to discover it was built on lies. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he whispered, his voice cracking again as the flood of emotions overwhelmed him. Was it all just a lie? Was any of it real? His eyes burned with unshed tears, but he forced them back. He wouldn't cry. He couldn't. Faith reached out, her hand tentative, as if unsure of how to approach him. "Gregory, please, I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." Gregory laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Sorry? That's all you've got? Do you think sorry is enough to fix this? To fix everything?" His words came out harsh, his chest tightening with every syllable. The pain of betrayal was sharp, deeper than anything he had ever felt. Faith looked down, her shoulders slumping as she whispered, "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I was protecting you from the past, but I should have been honest. I was wrong." "You should have been honest," Gregory echoed, his voice colder now. "But you weren't. You lied to me, Faith. You lied to our children. You destroyed everything, and now you want me to forgive you?" Faith's tears started to fall, but she didn't make a sound. She reached for him, but he stepped back, the space between them widening like a chasm he couldn't bridge. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Gregory said, his voice raw. "I don't know if I even know who you are anymore." The words felt heavy on his tongue, like he was speaking a truth that had been festering inside him for too long. For a moment, they both stood there, motionless. Gregory's chest was tight with emotion, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge and regret. What was he supposed to do now? How could he move forward when everything he thought he knew had been torn apart? "I love you, Gregory," Faith whispered, her voice barely audible. But Gregory didn't respond. The words felt hollow now, a poor substitute for the trust that had been shattered. He looked at her one last time, the anger and hurt swimming in his eyes. "I loved you," he replied softly, "but now, I don't know anymore." The silence that followed was suffocating. Gregory stood in the silence of the kitchen, his hands gripped tightly around the letter. Faith's tear-streaked face was just a few feet away, but the distance between them felt like miles. The room was heavy with the weight of the truth, a truth that had torn their lives apart in ways he couldn't begin to understand. Faith's voice, though barely a whisper, cut through the silence. "Gregory, I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I never wanted to hurt you." Gregory's lips pressed into a thin line. He couldn't bring himself to respond right away, the pain of her betrayal still too raw, too fresh. "How long, Faith? How long were you planning to keep this from me?" His voice was barely audible, as if speaking louder would make the weight of the betrayal heavier. Faith's eyes searched his face, her hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the countertop. "I don't know. It was just supposed to be something in the past, something I was supposed to forget, but I never did. I couldn't." Gregory shook his head, stepping away from her. He couldn't stand the sight of her now, her confession, her apologies. None of it felt real. "You couldn't forget?" he repeated bitterly. "You couldn't forget the man you were still in love with? The man you were still talking to behind my back? Faith's face crumpled as more tears spilled down her cheeks. It wasn't like that. I didn't want it to be like this. I never wanted to lose you, but I thought if I just kept it from you, kept everything hidden, it would all be okay. It would go away. But it didn't, did it? Gregory snapped, his frustration boiling over. It never went away, and now look at us. Look at what you've done. His hands shook as he reached for the letter again, the paper crumpling slightly under his grip. He opened it again, staring at the words, each sentence a reminder of the life he had built on lies. Ethan, her ex-lover, the man she had lied about, the man whose name had haunted their marriage like a shadow, creeping into every corner of their life until it had become impossible to ignore any longer. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Gregory said, his voice strained, barely above a whisper. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. I know, Faith whispered back. I don't expect you to, but I am so sorry, Gregory. I never meant for this to happen. I thought I could control it, but I couldn't. I was weak, and I let it consume me. Gregory took a deep breath, trying to hold himself together, but it felt like his chest was caving in. The years they had spent together, the memories, the promises, the love they had shared, now felt like a cruel illusion. How many moments had been real? How many had been built on nothing but empty words? He closed his eyes, trying to push away the overwhelming pain, but it wouldn't leave. He had thought he knew Faith. He had thought he knew everything about her, the good, the bad, the ugly. But now he didn't know who she was anymore. I don't know what to say to you, he said, his voice hoarse. His eyes opened again, and he looked at her. You've destroyed everything we built together. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Gregory wanted to scream, to shout at her, to make her understand the depth of the betrayal, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, all he felt was the emptiness that had filled the space where their love once was. Faith, still standing by the counter, looked up at him, her eyes wide with guilt and sorrow. I know, she whispered, the weight of her own words sinking in. I've lost you. Gregory didn't respond. He didn't know how to respond. The truth of her betrayal had shattered something inside of him, something he hadn't even realized was fragile until it was too late. I never wanted to hurt you, Faith said again, but the words felt hollow now. How could they mean anything after everything that had happened? Gregory's heart ached, but it wasn't the same ache of love. It was the ache of disappointment, of betrayal, of realizing that the life he had built with this woman was a lie. He shook his head once more, turning away from her, unable to look at her any longer. I need some space, he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. I need to think. As he walked toward the door, leaving the silence of the kitchen behind, he felt a part of himself break off with each step. There was no going back now. Faith's voice, fragile and broken, reached him just as he reached the door. Gregory, please. But he didn't turn around. He couldn't. And as the door clicked shut behind him, Gregory felt the last remnants of the life he thought he knew slip away. Gregory's world had become an unbearable weight. The once vibrant life he had shared with Faith now felt like a distant memory, one that he couldn't quite grasp. Each day dragged on, each moment a cruel reminder of how everything had unraveled. The space he once called home now felt like a prison. He had avoided Faith after the confrontation, his mind too raw, too fractured to engage with her. She had tried calling him, but each time he ignored it. The weight of her betrayal pressed down on him like an anchor, dragging him deeper into a darkness he couldn't escape. Days passed in a blur of confusion and anger. Gregory felt like a shell of himself, the man he had once been, the man who had believed in the sanctity of his marriage, the man who had trusted, was gone. In his place was someone barely recognizable. He was consumed with rage, with betrayal. The anger burned like a fire in his chest, relentless and all-consuming. The children were the only thing that kept him tethered to this world, but even their presence seemed to only highlight the emptiness he felt. He looked at them, and instead of seeing the innocent faces he had once loved, he saw reminders of everything that had been stolen from him. Every smile, every laugh, felt like a reminder that he had been living a lie. Gregory spent hours walking around the house, pacing back and forth, unable to settle. The silence was maddening. Even when Faith was in the other room, even when the children played in the living room, there was an emptiness that rang louder than any sound. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, his mind spinning in circles. He thought about confronting Faith again, demanding answers, but what good would it do? What more could she say? He had already heard everything, every excuse, every apology. They all rang hollow in his ears. Nothing could undo what had been done. Nothing could bring back the trust he had lost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Gregory found himself standing in the kitchen staring blankly at the counter. Faith's voice echoed in his mind. "I never meant to hurt you." The words had been repeated so many times, they had lost all meaning. He had heard them, but they didn't matter anymore. They couldn't fix what had been shattered. It wasn't just the affair. It wasn't just the lies. It was the fact that Faith had shattered everything they had built together. The foundation of their relationship, once so solid, was now nothing but dust. He had trusted her. He had believed in her. And now, all of that was gone. As he stood there, the anger inside him began to rise again. But it was different now. It wasn't just anger at Faith. It was a deeper, darker feeling, a sense of hopelessness that gnawed at him. He had lost control. He had lost everything, and there was nothing left to hold on to. His eyes wandered to the drawer where he kept the gun. It had been there for years, untouched. He had bought it for protection, for peace of mind. But now it felt like a symbol of his descent, a way to regain control, to silence the chaos in his mind. The thought of ending it all, of escaping the pain, was strangely comforting. But he didn't reach for the gun, not yet. Instead, he took a deep breath and closed his eyes, trying to center himself. There had to be a way out of this madness, a way to regain the life he had lost. But all he could see was the darkness, closing in on him, suffocating him with every passing second. That night, as Faith quietly prepared dinner, Gregory sat at the table, watching her from across the room. She seemed so normal, so calm, as if nothing had changed. But Gregory knew the truth. He knew what she had done, and he hated her for it. His fingers clenched into fists, and he felt the rage building again, stronger than before. Every time he looked at her, he felt like he was being suffocated, like the life was being drained out of him. The woman he had loved, the woman he had thought he knew, was gone. She was just a stranger now. Faith glanced up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Gregory," she started, but her voice trailed off as she saw the look in his eyes. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. The words felt trapped in his throat, suffocating him along with the anger. Instead, he stood up abruptly, walking toward the door. "I need some air," he muttered, not looking at her. Faith didn't follow him. She didn't try to stop him. She knew that this was beyond repair. Outside, the cold air hit him like a slap in the face. He walked aimlessly, his feet crunching the snow beneath him, but he didn't feel the cold. The numbness in his chest was far worse. The quiet of the night felt deafening, and with each step, the weight of his anger only grew heavier. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Peace? Revenge? The answers to questions that would never come? All he knew was that the darkness inside him was swallowing him whole. He couldn't outrun it. The only thing left now was to let it consume him. The darkness inside Gregory had settled into something unrecognizable, a force he couldn't control, a weight that consumed every corner of his mind. Each day, the anger and despair intertwined more deeply. His once bright thoughts had turned to shadows. Every waking moment, every glance at Faith only fed the fire of betrayal in his chest. He spent his days pacing the house, staring at the family photos that now felt like mockeries. The happy faces of the children, their innocent smiles, haunted him. He couldn't even look at them without seeing the ghosts of the lies Faith had told. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt truly alive, before the discovery of Ethan, before he realized that his world had been a carefully constructed illusion. He avoided Faith completely. She continued to apologize, to cry, to beg for his forgiveness. But none of it reached him. It was all too late. The trust had been broken, and with it the man Gregory once was. He was no longer the husband who loved his wife. He was a man consumed by hurt and rage, desperate to find a way to make it all stop. That evening, after Faith had gone to bed, Gregory sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the cluttered countertop. The house was eerily silent. The children were in their rooms, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the roof they lived under. He tried to think of how to fix this, how to make sense of the wreckage his life had become. His eyes drifted to the drawer where Faith had kept the paternity test results, hidden in a folder. The same test that had confirmed what he had feared, that the children weren't biologically his. The betrayal had taken root long before he had ever discovered the truth, and now, in the quiet of the night, The weight of that betrayal bore down on him like a vice. He walked to the drawer and pulled the test results from it, his hands trembling as he read them once more. This was all his fault. He had let it happen, let Faith's lies fester and grow. He thought of the life they had together, the vacations, the laughter, the promises they had made to each other. They had been nothing but an elaborate performance, a game played at his expense. Gregory's thoughts began to spiral, becoming more frantic and irrational. He imagined the worst: Faith running off with Ethan, the children growing up believing someone else was their father, the life he had built with her reduced to rubble. The overwhelming need for control surged within him, and the thought of regaining that control, of ending it all, ending the pain, felt like a sick form of liberation. He opened the kitchen drawer once more. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of the gun. It was always there, hidden in the back of the drawer, just out of sight. He had bought it years ago, never thinking he would need it. But now, in the quiet of the night, the weight of the gun felt like salvation. The cold, hard steel felt like an answer to everything, an end to the pain. Gregory closed his eyes, imagining it, a single, final act, a way to rid himself of the anguish, to put an end to the chaos swirling in his mind. The thought terrified him, and yet, it also offered a strange kind of peace, a way to escape. But there was something else too, a feeling of anger so deep it consumed him. His desire for control twisted into something darker. He didn't want to end it all, not yet, not without first making them understand. He wasn't going to go down without making sure they knew what they had done to him. His fingers tightened around the gun, and for a moment, the room felt even colder. He could feel his breath catch in his chest as the violent thoughts played out in his mind. He thought of the confrontation with Faith, the pain of hearing her admit to everything. He thought of the children, his children, though not biologically his, who had been caught in the crossfire of this betrayal. It wasn't just Faith he needed to punish. It was everyone. He stood there for what felt like hours, the weight of the weapon heavy in his hand. His mind raced. Was this it? Was this the way out? No, it wasn't. It couldn't be. The anger was too strong, too overwhelming. Gregory clenched his jaw. He wouldn't end it, not yet. He had to make them feel the way he did, broken, abandoned, betrayed. They had stolen everything from him, and now it was time for him to take something back. He walked to the bedroom, the gun still clutched in his hand, his mind a blur of anger and confusion. Faith was lying asleep on the bed, unaware of what he was planning. Her face, calm and serene in sleep, was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside him. He wanted to shake her awake, to scream at her, to make her understand the magnitude of the destruction she had caused, but he didn't. Instead, he set the gun down on the nightstand next to the bed. For now, it was enough just to hold the power in his hands, enough to know that he could take it all back if only he wanted to. For now, he would wait. He would make his next move carefully. He would make them pay. Gregory's mind had become a relentless storm. The anger that had been simmering for weeks now raged like wildfire, scorching everything in its path. His hands trembled as he sat in the dark, staring at the walls of his home, feeling the weight of the gun on the nightstand next to him. The house that once held laughter, love, and hope now felt hollow. He could hear Faith breathing softly next to him, oblivious to the chaos spiraling inside him. He had gone over it 1,000 times, the lies, the betrayal, the cold realization that his life, the life he had built with Faith, was a lie. Each time he thought about it, the rage swelled inside him. The feeling of being manipulated, of being a fool, was unbearable. Gregory turned his head to look at Faith. She was still asleep, her face relaxed, as if everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. He wasn't fine. And he wasn't sure he could ever go back to the man he once was. He had tried to hold it together. He had tried to move on, to let go of the anger, to find some way to fix it. But it was too late for that. The trust was shattered beyond repair. And Faith? Faith was still lying, still hiding, still pretending that nothing had changed. The thought of her with Ethan, of their secret conversations, gnawed at him like a disease. He had seen it in her eyes when she lied. He had heard it in her voice. The truth was there, buried deep, and Gregory had uncovered it. But what did that matter now? He had no control over it. He had no control over her, over the life they had built together. He needed to act. He couldn't keep pretending. The urge to confront her again, to demand the truth, was overwhelming. But something inside him was shifting. The more he thought about it, the more the idea of revenge began to take root. He had been wronged, he had been betrayed, and now he wanted to make sure she felt the pain he was feeling. His breathing quickened as the plan began to form in his mind. The pieces were falling into place. He didn't know exactly what he wanted to do, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep living this lie. He needed to make her feel the weight of the destruction she had caused. Gregory stood up from the bed, the movement causing the floorboards to creak. Faith stirred but didn't wake. He moved quietly to the nightstand and picked up the gun, his fingers trembling as he wrapped his hand around it. The cold metal felt solid in his grip, grounding him in a way nothing else had been able to. He wasn't thinking clearly. He knew that. The rage clouded his judgment, his sense of reason. But in that moment, he didn't care. The house was silent. The children were asleep, unaware of the storm brewing in their father's mind. Gregory's heart pounded in his chest as he moved toward the living room, trying to shake the feeling of detachment that had come over him. His every step felt deliberate, calculated. He was no longer the man who had trusted. He was someone else now. He stopped in the living room, staring at the family pictures on the wall. The smiling faces seemed so far removed from the reality he was living now. He couldn't look at them anymore. They were a lie. His grip on the gun tightened, and he felt the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. The rage was still there, but now it was joined by something else, a sense of power, of control. He could make it stop. He could end the pain. As he moved toward the front door, the gun in his hand felt like a lifeline. It was the only thing that made sense now, the only thing that could bring an end to this. But as he reached for the door, something inside him paused. A voice, small but persistent, whispered in the back of his mind. What was he doing? What had he become? He stopped, his hand inches away from the doorknob. For a moment, everything was still. The silence in the house was deafening. And then, the reality of what he was about to do hit him. Gregory shook his head, his mind racing. This wasn't who he was. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. He put the gun down on the table, taking a deep breath as he steadied himself. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Fear. Fear of what he had become. Fear of what he was capable of. He couldn't keep going down this path. He needed to stop. But as he stood there, the plan still lingering in the back of his mind, he realized that the breaking point was closer than he ever thought it would be. Faith had done something to him. She had shattered him. And now, all he could think about was how to make it stop. Gregory stood in the dim light of the living room, his heart racing, his breath shallow. The house felt like a cage. The silence was suffocating, and all he could think about was how it had all gone wrong. The betrayal, the lies, the years of trust shattered in an instant. Every word, every moment with Faith felt hollow now, like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. The gun sat on the table, its cold metal gleaming in the faint light. It had been there, in the corner of his mind, since the moment he first felt the betrayal. But now, with each passing day, the idea of using it, of ending the chaos that consumed him, felt more like a necessity than a choice. Faith had apologized again that morning, but it was always the same. Hollow words. Her tears had once been genuine, but now they were nothing but a part of the performance. He had seen the cracks in her mask, the truth in her eyes, and yet she couldn't see what he saw. She couldn't understand the depth of the destruction she had caused. The anger inside him was raw, like a wildfire waiting to consume everything in its path. He wanted to scream, to break something, to make the world understand what he had been through. But every time he opened his mouth, the words felt stuck, trapped in his throat, drowning in his own frustration. It wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't even about punishing Faith anymore. No, it was about control. He had lost control of everything, of his life, of his family, of himself. And the only way to regain it was to make the world bend to his will. He thought of Faith, of her empty apologies, of the way she had looked at him with those pleading eyes. She didn't get it. She didn't understand that the damage had already been done, that everything they had built together had already crumbled. Gregory's fingers twitched, and without thinking, he reached for the gun. The weight of it felt familiar, grounding. In that moment, it was the only thing that made sense. It was the only thing that could give him the power he so desperately needed. The cold metal felt heavy in his hand, but there was a strange sense of relief in it. The kind of relief that only comes when you finally make a decision, when you finally take control. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, staring at the weapon, wondering if this was really the end. He didn't want to hurt her. He didn't want to destroy everything completely. But the longer he stood there, the harder it was to hold back the rage. It wasn't just her anymore. It was everything. The life he had built, the love he had given. All of it had been shattered by a simple lie. And now, all he could think about was how to fix it, how to put the pieces back together. He had no answers, no solutions, only the growing need to make her feel what he had felt. The pain, the betrayal, the devastation. The door creaked open behind him, and he heard Faith's voice, soft and cautious. "Gregory?" Her voice was laced with uncertainty, a gentle tremor that echoed the fear in her heart. He didn't turn to look at her. He couldn't. The weight of her presence only deepened the sense of betrayal. Instead, he held the gun tighter, his knuckles turning white. "Gregory, please," she said again, her voice trembling now. "Don't do this." Her words cut through the haze of anger that had clouded his mind, and for a brief moment he hesitated. Was this really the end? Was there no way to fix this? No way to find peace? But the rage, the desire for control, drowned out her plea. He turned slowly, his face a mask of cold resolve. "It's too late for apologies," he muttered, his voice low and steady, yet filled with an intensity that made the air thick with tension. Faith took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. She had seen the change in him, felt it in every glance, every moment of silence that had passed between them. She knew now that the man she had married was gone, replaced by something darker, something that she could no longer reach. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "We can fix this. We can—" But Gregory shook his head, his gaze hardening. "You don't get it, Faith. You don't get it. This isn't something that can be fixed with more lies. This isn't something I can just forget." The gun was no longer a tool of protection. It was a weapon of reckoning, a symbol of everything he had lost, everything that had been taken from him. The power, the control, the love gone in an instant, and now it was time for him to take back what he could. "Please," Faith whispered again, stepping closer, her hands trembling at her sides. "Gregory, I'm sorry." But her words no longer held weight. The damage had been done. The silence between them deepened, thick and suffocating, as the gravity of the situation hung heavy in the air. Gregory stood there, the gun still in his hand, the fire inside him burning hotter than ever. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know what he would do. But in that moment, he finally felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: control. The air in the house was thick with tension, almost suffocating. Gregory stood in the living room, still holding the gun in his hand, staring at Faith. The weight of it all pressed down on him, but a twisted sense of power lingered in his chest. He was the one in control now. He could feel it. Every ounce of the rage he had bottled up for so long had finally come to a head. The decisions, the actions, everything was within his grasp. Faith was still standing by the door, her body tense, her eyes wide with fear. She was trembling, her hands slightly raised as if in a silent plea for him to stop, to listen. But Gregory couldn't listen anymore. There was nothing left to hear. "Please, Gregory," she said, her voice soft, breaking with emotion. "Please don't do this. We can fix it. I'll do anything. I'll make it right." Her eyes were filled with desperation, the kind of desperation that would have once moved him, but now felt empty, hollow. Gregory's grip tightened around the gun. He felt his heart racing, but it wasn't fear. It was a cold, calculated anger, an emotion he hadn't let himself feel in years. "It's too late for that," he muttered, his voice rough, barely audible. His eyes locked onto hers. "You broke everything, Faith. You destroyed us. And now, you want to pretend it's all okay? It's not. It will never be." He didn't want to look at her anymore. The image of her face, the face he once loved, was now a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. He turned away, pacing back and forth. His footsteps were heavy on the floor, the sound of his boots echoing in the silence that had settled between them. The sound of Faith's voice again broke through his thoughts, this time more frantic. "Gregory, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Please, we can fix this." But those words, those apologies, they no longer held meaning. He couldn't go back. The damage was done. He had seen the truth, and now there was no erasing it, no taking it back. As the words hung in the air, the decision made itself. Gregory could feel the finality of it in his bones, but something else stirred inside him, a voice that whispered through the chaos of his mind, a nagging feeling, a doubt, telling him that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. But it was too late to back out now. The path was set, and the only thing left was to see it through. His eyes flickered to the phone on the counter. The sudden thought was a spark, and before he could stop himself, his fingers were moving. His thumb hovered over the numbers. He wasn't sure why he was doing it, why he was about to make that call, but it felt like something he had to do. It wasn't just about ending this anymore. It wasn't just about revenge. It was something deeper, something primal. He pressed the call button. Faith's eyes went wide with panic as she saw him dialing. She rushed toward him, but Gregory stopped her with a single look, his gaze cold, unyielding. "Who are you calling?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. Gregory didn't answer. He didn't need to. The phone rang, the sound growing louder, more pronounced in the quiet room. His mind raced as the call connected. The line buzzed in his ear, and he felt the tension in his chest tighten even more. "Hello?" came the voice on the other end. Gregory's breath caught in his throat. It was Ethan, the man who had stolen everything from him, the man who had shattered his life. The words felt stuck, heavy in his chest, but there was something in his gut telling him this was the moment to make it all clear. "Listen closely," Gregory said, his voice low and steady. "You took something from me. You took my wife. You took my family. And now you're going to pay for it." The line went silent for a brief moment. Then there was a sharp intake of breath. "What are you talking about?" Ethan's voice was cautious now, tinged with uncertainty. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Gregory replied, his grip on the gun tightening. His mind was clouded with anger, but there was a strange sense of clarity as well. "You've ruined everything, Ethan, and I'm done pretending it doesn't matter." Faith's pleading voice broke through the conversation. "Gregory, please, please stop. Don't do this, I beg you." But it was too late. Gregory was beyond hearing her now. He felt detached, as if he were watching this all unfold from a distance, unable to stop what was happening. "You're going to regret this," Ethan said, his voice shaking, now fully aware of the danger in the situation. Gregory didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched out between them, thick with unspoken truths. "I'll make sure you regret it," Gregory said finally, his voice cold, the words landing like a promise. He ended the call. The room fell silent again. Faith was standing there, her face pale, her eyes filled with terror. Gregory turned to face her, his expression unreadable. His heart was pounding, the adrenaline pumping through his veins, but there was no turning back now. "You did this," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You made me like this." Faith stepped back, her hands shaking. "Please, Gregory, please stop." But Gregory was already gone. The finality of his actions was clear. The spark had been lit. There was no turning back. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint rustle of papers and the occasional shuffle of chairs. Gregory sat at the defendant's table, his posture slouched but his eyes alert, fixed on the proceedings before him. The weight of the trial, the weight of the lives he had destroyed, hung heavily in the air. Faith sat on the opposite side of the room, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were red from crying, but her gaze remained resolute, focused on Gregory, as if she were trying to understand him. Still, the anger that had once burned so brightly in him toward her had cooled into something more bitter, more final. He didn't look at her now. There was no point. She had no power over him anymore. He had already decided what he needed to do. The courtroom had filled with people, some curious, some repulsed by what had transpired in that house, the night when everything shattered. Gregory had shot and killed Faith, their children, his family, and now here he was sitting in front of a judge, a jury, and the cold eyes of the public waiting for the inevitable. The prosecution had painted a damning picture of Gregory. They had painted him as a man who had been consumed by jealousy, anger, and despair. They spoke of his obsessive behavior, his descent into madness, as his suspicions grew. But they also made it clear that none of it was enough to justify what he had done. The gun, they argued, was the instrument of destruction, but it was his mind that had already broken long before the first shot rang out. The defense, on the other hand, sought to present Gregory as a man pushed beyond his limits, driven to madness by the weight of betrayal. They painted a portrait of a man who had been broken by the woman he loved, who had been driven to an irreversible breaking point. It wasn't an excuse, they argued, but an explanation for his actions. Gregory had been stone-faced throughout it all. There was no remorse in his eyes, no fear. He simply sat there, waiting for the next step in the process, the next chapter in this terrible story to unfold. He knew what was coming. He had known it since the moment he pulled the trigger. Faith's testimony was short but piercing. She spoke of the man she once loved, the man she thought she knew. She spoke of the lies, the betrayal, and the shock when she realized just how deep the rift between them had grown. She said that Gregory had always been a man of trust, a man who believed in family above all else. And when that trust had been shattered, when the foundation of their family was cracked by the truth, he had snapped. Gregory didn't flinch. He didn't respond. He just listened, his face cold, his thoughts distant. The words Faith spoke no longer held meaning. They were just echoes of a life he no longer cared to recall. The prosecution called their final witness, Detective Harris, the lead investigator on the case. He took the stand and described the scene in graphic detail, the blood, the chaos, the broken family. He spoke of the children, 2 innocent lives lost, and he spoke of Faith's final moments. There were no surprises in his testimony, no new revelations. It was all too familiar now. Gregory sat still, staring ahead, lost in his own thoughts. It was hard to remember how things had been before the doubts, before the lies, before the gun. It was all a blur now. The days of sitting across from Faith, talking about their dreams, their future, seemed so distant. And in their place was nothing but this trial, the aftermath of his rage. The defense attorney rose to speak. He argued that Gregory had been consumed by the betrayal, that his actions were the result of years of emotional neglect. He spoke of the mounting pressure Gregory had faced, the isolation, the unspoken pain of discovering the truth. He begged the jury for mercy, citing Gregory's emotional turmoil and the breakdown of his mental state. But Gregory didn't need mercy, not anymore. The truth was too simple, too clear. He had made his choice, and there was no going back. The jury deliberated for hours, but the outcome was inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming. Gregory was guilty of the murders of Faith and their children. The only question that remained was how to punish him for the lives he had taken. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as the verdict was read aloud. Life without parole. There would be no second chance for Gregory. He sat there, numb. It wasn't a surprise. It never had been. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, sealing his fate. Gregory was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his expression unchanged, his thoughts distant. He had known from the moment he fired that gun that this was where he would end up. There was no redemption, no way to undo what had been done. As he was led down the hallway, away from the courtroom, away from the life he had known, Gregory finally allowed himself a single thought: it's over. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a strange emptiness inside. The anger, the rage had finally burned out. All that was left was silence. The prison gates clanged shut behind Gregory, the sound reverberating in his ears as he stepped across the threshold. It wasn't the first time he had been locked up. As a child, he had spent countless hours in his mind, in his own personal prison of anger and confusion. But now, standing here, the walls felt different. They were real. There was no escaping them. He didn't feel the weight of the handcuffs anymore. His wrists had gone numb. He didn't feel the cold steel of the bars either. He had long stopped feeling anything at all, except for the hollow ache inside his chest that refused to disappear. The same ache that had driven him to destroy everything he loved. The same ache that had made him pull the trigger. As they led him down the sterile hallways of the prison, his thoughts drifted to Faith, to the children, the faces he could never forget, the faces of the people he had killed. They haunted him in every moment of silence. He could still see their faces, especially Faith's. The last time he looked at her, her eyes had been filled with fear, but there was also a glimmer of something else. Hope, perhaps. A hope that she could fix things, that they could go back to the way it was before. But it was too late. Faith's face, her voice, the last words she had said to him. Please, don't do this. He could hear them echo in his mind, louder than ever. He wished he could have stopped, wished he could have found the strength to let go, but he didn't. And now, here he was, locked in a cage, with nothing but memories and regrets. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his reverie. The guards had stopped walking, and Gregory realized they had reached his cell. He was led inside, the door sliding shut behind him with a soft mechanical hiss. The cold concrete walls stared back at him, and the tiny cot in the corner offered no comfort. He sat on the cot, running his fingers through his hair, the weight of everything crashing down on him once again. He had killed his family. He had killed the people who mattered most to him. His mind flashed back to the moment when it all happened, the gunshot that ended everything. The sound was still so vivid in his ears, the panic in his chest, the numbness that followed, the regret, the grief. It all came too late. Gregory's hand tightened into a fist as he looked down at the cold floor beneath him. He couldn't escape the truth. There was no redemption, no going back. The life he had lived, the life he had destroyed, was beyond repair. In his cell, there were no distractions, no escapes. He had only his thoughts, his memories, and the oppressive silence that seemed to swallow him whole. No matter how much he tried to push them away, the faces of his children, the terrified look in Faith's eyes, would never leave him. They were his punishment now, and he deserved it. It wasn't just the death of his family that he had to live with. It was the knowledge that he had destroyed their future, their hope. He had stolen the lives of the people who trusted him the most, the people who had loved him despite everything. And now, as the prison bars closed around him, he realized he had stolen his own life too. There would be no more chances, no more do-overs. He would never hold his children again, never feel the warmth of Faith's touch. That future was gone. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Gregory spent his time in a haze, wandering through the labyrinth of his mind, constantly retracing the steps that led him here. His cell became a reflection of the isolation he had already felt inside, a place where he could do nothing but confront the depth of his failure. Faith's voice, her pleas for him to stop, still haunted him, but now there was no more space for anger, no more room for the fiery rage that had consumed him before. It had all burned out, leaving behind nothing but cold emptiness. The weight of the consequences was too much to bear. There was no escaping it, no running from what he had done. He had made his choice, and now it was too late for regrets. The other prisoners ignored him, as they did everyone who had made their way here for the unforgivable. Gregory was nothing more than a shadow in their eyes, just another man who had broken. He was no different from any of them, and that was the truth that burned the most. He had always thought that being locked away would be the worst punishment, that being caged in a cell would be the ultimate end. But he had learned differently. The true punishment wasn't the concrete walls, the cold cell, or the isolation. The true punishment was living with what he had done, living with the knowledge that he would never make things right, that he could never go back. As the days dragged on, Gregory's mind became a dull echo of the life he had once lived. The faces of his family, their voices, everything he had lost, faded into the background of his mind, but the guilt never went away. It was a constant presence, gnawing at him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. Gregory had killed the people he loved, and now there was nothing left but the hollow emptiness that would remain for the rest of his days. Keywords: family tragedy, murder, mystery psychological thriller, crime documentary, betrayal and marriage hashtags, true crime family massacre psychological thriller, murder mystery crime story YouTube video description, SEO optimized. In this emotional true crime documentary, the devastating story of Gregory Green, who murdered his wife and children after discovering they were not his biological children, unfolds. This psychological thriller reveals the deep betrayal, emotional chaos, and tragic consequences of a fractured family. Watch the gripping tale of deception and loss that led to an unthinkable tragedy. Based on real-life events, this video dives deep into the psychological turmoil that drove a father to the brink of violence. Source: this tragic story is based on the real-life case of Gregory Green, who was convicted in 2016 for the murder of his wife and children after discovering they were not biologically his. More details about the case can be found in various news sources, including Gregory Green Case, Michigan.